My name is Uzma Ali and I have a bachelor's degree in neuroscience. Upon receiving my diploma, I not only gained proof of education, but also spidey senses, and they tingle whenever somebody brings up something about the brain. So imagine me in the theater of Poor Things watching the Godwin Baxter transplant a baby brain into the head of a fully grown woman. It looked something like this. Now, unfortunately, my power ends in spidey senses. I'm not equipped with the entire literature of knowledge on neuroscience, so whenever I do see something that triggers them, I get this insatiable itch to research what I had just witnessed. It's more of a blessing than a curse, but you get to watch the byproduct of all of that. So today's question is, how would a brain transplant work? As I'm sure you can guess, the ethics behind this procedure are questionable at best, and whole head transplants have been researched better than just brain transplants, so we're gonna look at both. And the specific kind of brain transplant that happens in Poor Things, putting a baby's brain into a grown woman's brain, that is much less research, and at this point in science, maybe impossible. Maybe not. We're gonna talk about it a little bit later. Starting with number 1, the history of a head transplant, number 2, the procedure of a head transplant, and number 3, the hypothetical procedure and challenges of just a brain transplant. I am really excited. This is probably gonna be one of my favorite videos that I've done so far, which is not a lot. I've done like 5. I don't know, it's just so cool and morbid and gross. So I hope you're as excited as I am. Also, I am gonna change out of this costume because it is really uncomfortable. The shirt that I bought is one size too small for me, and I feel like it's gonna pop like any second now. So I'm gonna go. Change into something a little bit more comfy cozy. We're first going to talk about whole head transplants, which is obviously different than just the brain transplant because you're just picking up the head and then moving it onto another body, whereas with the brain you're taking out the brain and then putting it into another head. I think it's absolutely crazy and borderline science fictional to look at the history behind these, so that's exactly what we're going to do. The official term for which these mad scientists use is cephalosomatic anastomosis, which is the surgical procedure that reconnects a head to a body at the cervical level, which is just the first couple of few vertebrae that are up in the spine in your neck over here. And that's something that I always love about science. All of the terms mean exactly what they're supposed to mean. Like, you look at the Greek and Latin roots and it's just like a direct translation into English, and I love it. Cephalo means head, soma means body, and anastomosis means outlet or opening. And that's basically what these scientists are trying to do. They're trying to connect the outlets and openings of the head and the body together, such that they can flow smoothly. At least that's what they're attempting to do. The first attempt was in 1908. Scientist Charles Guthrie, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, attempted to transplant the head of a donor dog onto a recipient dog. Unfortunately, it was an unsuccessful endeavor. But another Russian scientist in the year of 1950 named Vladimir Demikov tried a similar thing, also with dogs, and hopefully this is not too sensitive for my dog lovers out there. The only successful creature that he produced was like this double-headed dog. It was like a 2/3 Cerberus, if you will. I don't know if it's appropriate to make any type of jokes in this scenario. This dog actually survived for several days. See, these researchers were obviously going to start with animals for this experiment because it's a lot more ethically acceptable for them to do on animals first as opposed to humans. PETA would probably argue with that, and if they made their location of the experiments public, they'd come with a big poster and they would start screaming until they were pushed away. Point being, a human transplant poses more ethical questions than an animal one does. So naturally the next one was a monkey. This was in 1970. This scientist, he's actually pretty cool. I watched a couple of interviews with him. His name is Robert White. He performed the first successful cephalic exchange transmission in the monkey by transplanting the head of a rhesus monkey onto the body of another headless one. It took a team of 30 people, there were chalk marks on the floor that choreographed where everybody was supposed to go, and the procedure ended up taking 18 hours. And the monkey survived for 8 days with restoration of its basic senses that are in the face, like smelling, taste, hearing, vision, as well as motor function in the face, being able to blink your eyes and also being able to like do a little bit of your nose scrunches, like stuff in the face. But see, the issue here among many is that the monkey was paralyzed from the neck down. So yes, they maintained facial functions, but in order for the brain to actually be able to communicate with the rest of the body, you would have to do a bunch of tiny little microsurgeries on the blood vessels, on the neurons that have all been severed and disconnected, because the disco people of the 70s hadn't thought of a better way to do that. But just you hold on to your butts. Grab them. Give them a good squish. Oh my god. I don't know. The same guy, Dr. Robert White, wanted to do a similar thing with humans, but he did caution that the end result would basically just be like a pillow head. You would have a body, but you couldn't move it. The only thing you can move is your head, so you could watch TV. He said that you could watch Oprah, but that's like all you can do. Wait, Oprah? When did Oprah gain her fame? 1986, so a little bit later. Because I was like, she was not around in 1970. Robert White probably was, in both 1970 and 1980. Anyways, that brings us to the late 80s and early 90s. 1990s were some Japanese researchers, including one by the name of Hirabayashi. He attempted to do a transplant with rats. And this one is interesting here because the goal was actually to figure out if facial bones are able to grow on their own independent of the rest of the body. Not exactly the same purpose here, but it still counts in the history of it. The means by which they did this is they transplanted the head of an infant rat onto the head of a grown isohistogenic adult rat. And when I say isohistogenic, that basically just means that both the donor and the recipient have very similar characteristics, both in their genes and in their tissue. So an isohistogenic body is obviously important in order for any kind of procedure like this to work. But the infant head to the adult body, that kind of sounds like the most similar thing that we've got to poor things so far, right? I don't know if they've done anything else like that out there, but I doubt it because I tried looking for it and I couldn't find anything. There's this thing so far. In this experiment, they chose a specific breed of rats. They were a Lewis rat that had large enough blood vessels in order for them to do anastomosis, sewing together the actual blood vessels themselves. And it worked. The infant head, it grew onto this like adult body. And their hypothesis was proven right that facial bones do grow on their own. Crazy. Let's kick it a couple decades later. It is now the year 2013 and technology has advanced far enough for neurosurgeon Dr. Sergio Canavero to describe a functional model for head transplants for human beings, which we, my friends, will go into terrible detail. The ideal candidate for a head transplant, if anybody were to want it and if our technology were to become so advanced to do such a thing, which it might, would be a person whose body is riddled with disease but their head and their brain still remain intact. So giving them a new body would virtually give them a new chance at life. As I mentioned, we're going to walk through the head transplant procedure first because it's a little bit more well researched than the brain, but it will set up the stage for us, okay? And I still think it's interesting. Like, it's still very science fictional and silly, so. Here, Dr. Canavero really lays it all out and he is still doing some very important seminal work in the field. Thank you, doctor. We will return to it. Here's how it's gonna go. The procedure requires a body recipient and a body donor. And the only way to execute the exchange is to effectively induce hypothermia in both. The recipient undergoes head hypothermia, whereas the donor undergoes spinal cord hypothermia. This should span for about an hour, and the purpose of this, interestingly, is that mammals can actually sustain their own bodies without blood flow. That's what happens when you induce hypothermia in them. For about an hour at the temperature of about 12 to 15 degrees Celsius. For Fahrenheit, that's like 53.6 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Normally, we're at 98.6 or something like that, right? So this is a change. And once the recipient's head is cooled to such a temperature, the scientists can disconnect it from its original body. This is the head that they're going to keep, right? The recipient is the one that's going to be receiving the body from the donor, yeah? This head must be drained of blood and flushed with an iced solution called Ringer's lactate. Ringer's lactate is a fluid that is used to replace water and electrolytes in patients with low blood volume or low blood pressure. And then to maintain bodily function, the head must be reattached to the new body within the hour, otherwise bodily function will not be sustained. And surprisingly, cardiac surgery has showed that like total circulatory arrest for about 45 minutes does no discernible neurological damage to you, but it does increase a little bit when you approach the hour. And then Dr. Canavero goes into excessive detail about the actual procedure, which I don't think we have to go into as much detail, but give us like a little bit of a rundown. So the incisions are made around the 4th to 6th cervical vertebrae, and then individual arteries up in here would be looped with silk thread and threaded into tiny glass tubes, which they will be capped at. This does stop blood flow, yes. And then larger blood vessels like the carotid artery and the jugular veins, they would be cannulated or transferred through a separate tube into a metal compartment where it would be cooled and then reintroduced into the new body. At which point anastomosis would be conducted to sew all the blood vessels together. Great, right? No. We jumped the gun a little bit too fast. For an effective transplant, there is one little measure that we're missing here. How is the new organ actually meant to communicate with the rest of the body? We don't want this to be some kind of 1970 Robert White monkey type situation where you're paralyzed from the neck down. No siree. How are you going to be able to do something like move your hands if your brain can't send the signal to your hands to actually get yourself to move your hands? Here is the issue of the spinal cord. If unfamiliar, this tube of tissue runs from your brain to your lower back, carrying nerve signals all throughout your body, helping you feel sensations, move your body, keep breathing, etc. They communicate this, of course, through long axons running within it, which are the fibers extending from a neuron that allow it to communicate with other gather neurons for longer distances in the body. A lot of definitions there, I know. I just want to make sure we're all on the same level here, okay? Because my goal is to make accessible content that anyone can watch and anyone can enjoy. Thank you for your cooperation. So to make this transfer as clean as possible, we must sever the spinal cord with a clean cut. But now we have all of these split axons. What are we meant to do with these? Mind you, these are like teensy tiny microscopic little fibers that would be very, very difficult to actually like do surgeries on. I mean, technically it would be feasible, but it would take a lot of time, more than the hour that is needed to actually do the procedure right. So we're short on time. How are we actually meant to reconnect these axons together so that the brain is communicating with the body? Well, you see, there are some inorganic polymers, such as one named polyethylene glycol, aka PEG or PEG. Don't be weird. It's both water soluble and non-toxic in the human body. And research since the year of 1999 has proven that immediately lathering these severed axons in PEG, and I do mean literally lathering them on, like topical application, gotta like dip it into some. Injections also work too, but they're a little bit less effective. So topical application here is the way to go. Lather both the severed axons in the donor and the recipient in PEG, stick them together. I'm not kidding. Recovery is stable for at least a month and improves over time. So with PEG, we can sever these axons in both the donor and the recipient. We can stick them together and we basically can form a brand new spinal cord. Yeah, although I mentioned that PEG injections are not nearly as effective for bridging the axons back together, if you do injections, they can cross into the blood-brain barrier and target any areas up in the brain that have any injury that may have been retained throughout the procedure. And I must note that some researchers have developed a few extra steps with the PEG in order to make this as efficient as possible. So if you're like really well versed in scientific language and you want to know more, then I'm just gonna have to point you to the paper in my description because I don't want to. I'm just making my weekly YouTube video. You see, that is why the donor had to undergo spinal cord hypothermia, because that part needed to be cooled in order to be reconnected with the head of the recipient. Freezing body parts gives us a little bit of time to do that without really killing anything. Isn't that so cool? And then finally, of course, everything would be sewn back together, chill in the ICU for 3 days, and you're good. In the year 2017, Dr. Canavero, who wrote this paper, and some of his colleagues got together. They're like, okay, we're talking about the procedure of how to do it. We saw these other people do it on animals, but can we actually do it with humans? So they met up with each other and they did it. To be fair, it was with cadavers because they didn't want to actually put any human lives at risk. These ones were already dead. No lives at stake here, baby. We are so ethical, even though Dr. Canavero has definitely received some criticism for his controversial procedure here. After careful choreography and practice, his buds all got together for this 18-hour procedure using a cadaver recipient and a cadaver donor, and they successfully carried out the head transplant procedure. Since the bodies were not of the earth anymore, this was more of just a kind of rehearsal for the real thing if anybody were to eventually do that, I don't know. We have no clue of knowing that the head might just reject the body's other organs or vice versa, which is something that Dr. Canavero kind of argues by claiming that the brain is an immunoprivileged organ, so he says it could hypothetically work. But no successful human head transplantation has actually occurred yet. So this stuff of poor things is still pretty far out. So yes, new body, new you, same head though. What if we want a brand new body all fresh and clean with all pieces upgraded, including the head? Well then. Now we're not just taking a head off of one body and putting it on another. That is rookie behavior. We are now taking the brain out of one head and putting it into another. This section is going to talk about the challenges that we have not yet quite overcome to accomplish this procedure. What do we need to learn to get from here to there? Why should it be any different? Well, the challenges in conducting a successful brain transplant are threefold, as they say. Let's do it, babies. Number 1, extracting the brain proper from the dura mater. The dura mater is a layer of tissue that make up one of the 3 meninges covering our brain. Meninges just means layers. It is the outermost layer, and it is the toughest or the most durable. These layers encase the brain and all the fluid that flows inside of it, called the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, because I might not want to call it that every single time, I don't know. Circulation of this fluid is a carefully constructed art piece. Taking the brain out of it would disrupt the delicate balance. Okay, so then are we meant to bring these meninges with us? Yes. For the brain that we have chosen to keep, start with an incision at the nose and go up, 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 and down, 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 all the way to where? I have to look at my notes. Down to cervical vertebra numero 7. Scalp and remove the skull in standard fashion, because apparently there's a standard fashion for this. And there must be multiple burr holes drilled in throughout for smooth extraction of the dura, detachment from the skull. And then hypothetically in this scenario, you would have to detach the skull from itself. I don't know why I've been having such a hard time trying to explain this, so I'm just going to show you a picture up on the screen. So, yes. Then comes bone removal. If there are any surgeons watching this, the technical term is the Lefort 3 osteotomy, Lefort the third osteotomy, I know it's not that, where the front of the skull is removed. Then the brain can be removed along with the dural sac and some of the top parts of the cervical cord right over here. Yay! Apparently the basal dura is left in place, but the brain still remains fully encased. I don't know exactly how that all works, but that's what Dr. Canavero said. So yes, scoop it out and we're good to go. Technically feasible. Okay, challenge number 1. You really weren't a challenge after all, but what about obstacle number 2? Resuturing the internal carotid and vertebral arteries as well as the internal jugular veins. This is a little bit more difficult than the head transplant because all of the vessels are moving up kind of in the skull in difficult and hard to reach places, so basic anastomosis is not going to work the way it did the first time. In this case, we introduce sutureless vascular anastomosis. So we're not sewing these little girls together at all. What can we do instead? Well, there are 4 possibilities. An expandable stent can be inserted in both stumps, which are then approximated, at which the stent can fully expand and allow the blood flow to flow in between the 2 newly connected blood vessels, which are now 1, I guess. Another one is a polymer like the PEG that we talked about in the second part over there. That could be injected into the walls of the blood vessels to stick them together. Or another kind of stent could be pinned into the walls. I hope I'm showing you pictures while you guys are watching this because otherwise it really doesn't make any sense, I feel like. Or lastly, where the blood vessels are cut, we could put little magnetic connectors on the end of each of them and then stick them together with the power of magnetic force. So yes, it sounds a little bit ludicrous, but technically feasible. Okay, number 1 done, number 2 done, but what about number 3? Will this be feasible? Or will it not be? Number 3 is reconnecting the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The cranial nerves are a set of 12 pairs of nerves that pass from the brain through openings in the skull to different areas of the upper body. They all have like around less than 100,000 axons each, but the optic nerve is the outlier and it has over 1,200,000 fibers, so that's a lot. Just like with blood vessels, the sutured anastomosis will not work here again. The cramped spaces, there's too much going on. It's difficult up in here. Possible solutions? Dr. Canavero suggests the PEG that we used before. So, technically feasible. So why aren't we just doing this already? Yeah, this is all theoretical and nobody has yet tried this on a human model, so I don't recommend that you go get your stents and you go get a friend that wants a new body and also another brain-dead person to conduct. I don't recommend that you do this because you'll probably just run into some issue that we don't know about yet because it just hasn't been attempted yet. Now, when it comes to the poor thing scenario, okay, knowing what we know now, it's probably not possible yet, but let's talk about how it might work. And this is just me using my little measly, pathetic bachelor's of science degree, okay? I couldn't find any literature about this, obviously, because no one's writing papers about poor things. No scientific academic journals are publishing papers about this, so this is just me with my meager knowledge, accept it or don't. A big part of this procedure is figuring out if the blood vessels of the recipient and the donor are kind of the same size and mapped out in the body in a similar fashion. And for an infant and adult to share those same qualities, the right size of the vasculature, the right mapping of the vasculature, it's not probable. Maybe it's possible that surgeons one day can create some kind of device that tapers the big adult blood vessels to go into a smaller, little tinier baby blood vessel so that the blood vessels can actually flow into each other, but like, I don't really see a point in creating that. I don't think that this kind of procedure is going to be in demand anytime soon, right? Like no. And then as the baby grows, you'll need to modify the tapering of that little device because the baby's growing, the blood vessels are also growing inside of that baby, so it's not going to stay the same size. So whatever that tapering device that you used before has to be modified as the baby grows up, which is just so much work. You have to do all of it all over again and multiple times throughout that person's life. Also, I would imagine that in order for a baby brain to fit comfortably inside of an adult brain, you need a lot of cerebrospinal fluid to like encase the brain inside of this huge skull that it it doesn't fit in. You know, because the fluid would give it some kind of cush so it can sit in there comfortably, right? But then again, as the baby's brain grows inside of this grown adult body, you'd have to drain that cerebrospinal fluid out to make space for the growing baby's brain so as not to create pressure and then damage to the brain. So yeah, it's just kind of crazy, but I think that's how it would work. If anyone did that, I think that would be literally insane. They would probably be sent to jail. But I just thought that I should tell you how all of that would probably work since I was dressed up in my Poor Things costume and, you know, made the thumbnail as Poor Things. I thought that I would connect it back. And to conclude, what did we learn today? Number one, we talked about the history behind head transplants, then we talked about the procedure of a head transplant, and then we talked about the hypothetical procedure and maybe easy to overcome challenges of a brain transplant. That's fun, right? This was a really, really fun video for me to create just because it's like, oh my god, I didn't think that there would be so much literature out there on the topic, but there was, and that's really fun for me. I hope you guys had as much fun as I did. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe and the notifications and all of those things, but yeah, I'll see you next time, guys. Mwah. I love you so much. Thank you for all of the love and all the subscribers that have been coming recently. I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you're finding me and you like me. And I'm not just tagging to the void, so yeah. Mwah. Okay, bye.